cheat out of it to get to the portion that actually matters. Now, this does not mean, again, that the bicep gets absolutely nothing from that bottom lengthened position. But it does, however, seem to signify that most of the gains that people get from the incline curl, they do not get from that lengthened position. If anything, that lengthened position is just a way to rebound into the 90-degree angle, at which point they get most of the hypertrophy. But because they focus on the sensation, they hyper-focus on that stretch at the bottom that might only really be a byproduct of the gains they are getting at the end of the day. And the problem in allowing that bottom portion where the muscle is mechanically weakest to dictate the load that you're going to use for the lift, because since it's the weakest link, this is the part that is going to dictate the dumbbell you're going to grab, is that you also find out that this means that this 90-degree portion of the bicep, where it's the strongest, might actually be limited by that portion where it's the weakest, meaning that you end up with one or two choices. Either A, you don't cheat at the bottom at all, but you end up using a weight that isn't really challenging because, well, once you're past that weak part, you're very strong at that 90% part, so it's very easy to do, but that's the part that gets you the most gain, so now you use baby weight for it and you're not actually getting the results that you want. Or B, you use a weight that is challenging for that 90-degree portion angle, but that forces you to cheat to get to that 90-degree angle I just described. So either way, this disparity in mechanical tensions means that the load that you're using is never actually appropriate. In which case I ask, why aren't you just training the 90-degree portion angle and skip that bottom portion, since at the end of the day, what you're redoing with the incline curl is you're trying to do two things at once. I'm not even really advocating for people not to train in the lengthened position, because I do believe it has its place. But don't do the two at the same time. Don't train the lengthened portion and the 90-degree portion angle at the same time, because now you're getting the worst of both worlds.
Is the idea of matching the force curve. People will say, like, well, tension grows muscles, and I can't produce a ton of tension when the muscle is at its sort of fully lengthened in anatomically relevant position. I can produce a ton of tension. Like, I can only lift the 40 from here to here, but I can lift the 80 from here to here. Shouldn't I get the 80s, cheat a little bit to get to this mid-range, and then pump out reps and then put it down? Why would I do a strict only 40 because it's only 40 pounds of tension versus the 80 I could be using? Okay, seems like something to think about for sure. Excellent point that you guys brought up. However, muscle seems to grow predominantly, if not solely, when per fiber force is actually generated, not whole muscle. Each individual muscle fiber, when it's generating a lot of force, that's what stimulates that muscle fiber to grow, not the total force. So the weight of the dumbbell isn't the concern. The concern is each muscle cell, how much force is it really producing? Now, secondly, and super importantly, internally, how much force the muscle is producing is what causes growth. If we say we lift the 80 from here to here, that can be the same amount of internal muscular force as the 40 from here to here, but the only reason the 80 is liftable from here to here is just a leverage advantage. Your muscles are pulling just as hard at that stretch position. The internal force generated per fiber is ultra high, with the 40 from here to here just as high as the 80 from here to here. And here's the real kicker. Muscles seem to grow even better when they produce maximum internal per fiber force at a stretched position. Stretch plus tension seems to cause more growth than just tension without a stretch. So interestingly enough, going and using the 40-pound dumbbell all the way from a stretch, all the way either for a full range of motion or even just the bottom position, probably grows just as much muscle, at least just as much, and probably more than using the 80 in the range of motion and leverage through which you can actually lift the 80. So the verdict on that is that because loaded stretch seems to grow muscle the most, and the internal load can be maximized at the stretch, you just got to pull really hard, and even though you can only lift a 40, the muscle is internally still producing just as much force to the tendon, and each muscle cell in there is producing just as much force as it can. Same amount of force it produces with the 80, it's just better leverage to lift the 80 than the 40 down here. And because that stretch adds a bit of hypertrophic stimulus, skipping it and going to the, cheating out of that range and getting right into the business range for the heavy weights is probably actively a bad idea. And it just seems to be another excuse to lift more weight. So if someone says, fuck man, I got to cheat up to get the 80s to here, and then I do this and then I put them down, you could say, well, if you didn't cheat and you just use the 40s and you did a full range of motion or even just at the bottom, wouldn't the internal force and stretch make a bigger stimulus, or at least the same stimulus, without having to cheat? And the answer is fucking yes. So it seems that if we think about it, like, well, hold on a sec, my force curve is optimized here, I got to lift more weight. Yeah, external weight, that's true. But the internal load generated by the muscles is higher when they're in a disadvantaged position. Another way to think about this, and this is a cue we actually use in training sometimes, Jared Feather and I, is you want to expose the musculature to the highest internal tension. You don't want to leverage the muscle to produce as much force as possible externally, because then you lift more weight, sweet, but that doesn't actually hit the muscle up as much as it could. For example, if you want to leverage the glutes to produce as much external force as possible, partial deadlifts are amazing because you can lift fucking like 1 trillion pounds. But if you do ultra deficit deadlifts, it stretches the glutes out like crazy. And all of a sudden you go from deadlifting 400 for reps to deadlifting 200 for reps. But the glute musculature itself produces basically the same amount of force. It's just that the leverage sucks. So the external load has to be lower. However, because it starts from a stretch position, deficit deadlifting probably is more hypertrophic for the glutes. So this argument that we have to match the force curve, it's nice if the goal is to lift as much weight as possible. And for powerlifters and strength athletes, you definitely want to match force curves to get into the real life ability to lift heavy ass weight. Like if you're an arm wrestler, for example, and the business end of your range is here to here, cheat curls are probably a fucking good idea. Cheat on the concentric, real nasty eccentric, amazing. Motherfucker, you're not an arm wrestler. You're trying to get jacked. That's why you watch this channel. Look, if you're an arm wrestler, first of all, please don't snap my shit in half. Second of all, total fucking respect. And then cheating in a sense is sport specific. But if you're not an arm wrestler and you just want to get jacked, you don't want to have to put yourself at an extra risk of getting hurt and an extra high fatigue from having a fucking cheat curl 225 in order to get the same gains or even slightly worse gains than you could from just curling 100 and putting your muscles at a leverage disadvantage so that internal force at the stretch is what has to do all the work. So that one dies a quick death.
And it doesn't just stop at the set and the quality of the set that you get. It also directly impacts progressive overload. By a show of hands of how many of you guys who do incline curls in their programs have a tough time progressively overloading and going up in weight. I'm certain that the number is going to be many for a simple reason. You will find that it's very difficult to progress on that lift because since the strength curve is all over the place and wacky, you end up finding that if you want to go up in weight, this means you're going to have to cheat more at the bottom with more forward elbow movement. The 90-degree angle is impacted by that bottom portion of the lengthened position of the bicep, at which point, again, I ask, why are you letting that bottom portion dictate the weight you can use on that 90-degree angle since it damaged the performance of both?
A little bit of tension here, inward on the bicep. You are shortening the hell out of this head of your bicep, and you are not taking any tension off at the top. I understand what people are saying when they say tension off of the biceps if you go like this, because their elbows are here. It's hard for me to contract my bicep too. The second you have that forward flexion at the glenohumeral joint and you're pushing your elbows in, you're contracting the hell out of your bicep. So that just limits the load you can use. Notice he was really curling super well before I gave him a couple of cues, and then how hard it looked for him to do that. People don't like to limit the load on the exercise. When you curl with your elbows at your side at 90 degrees, it's easy as fuck to use like 95 pounds, 135 pounds for someone like me. But I don't give a shit about the weight on the bar. And you guys really shouldn't either. We want a good stimulus to the biceps. We want full motor unit recruitment of the biceps. And that's done by going through a full range of motion, including all actions of that particular muscle, including, again, forward flexion at the glenohumeral joint.